Barnett. Welcome to the lockdown sessions.
Hi, Brad.
That's the only time I'm going to say Ruby, because the rest of the time I'll probably end up calling you by my nickname for you, which is Fana.
Absolutely fine. I answer to most things, and Ruth Anna is still my name too. So I will answer.
Look, welcome, and thank you for coming on, because we're coming to the end of all of these podcast sessions, right? Because when the world comes out of lockdown, it seems ridiculous to run a podcast called the Lockdown Sessions. But they've all been about learnings and observations, both in ourselves and on others, the people that we've been living with. And from your perspective, particularly someone who has connections all over the world, we were talking just offline about travel and living in different places, and you have connections literally on every continent.
Mm-hmm.
How have you experienced the pandemic and lockdown, and then on top of that, coming out of it, how are you starting to reconnect?
So I mean, I'm sure everybody has an interesting and unique answer to these questions. My situation was particularly special in that I got sick at the very beginning of everything happening. So actually the 10th of March last year, I won't forget the date. And so I kind of came down with a strange illness, which actually, because I live in California, I was actually in my sick bed, I think 3 or 4 days before the state lockdown. So I kind of watched my state, the country never did in the US, but the rest of the world kind of closed down as I was in my sick bed, experiencing symptoms that I didn't know at the time, and I still don't definitively know, but I didn't know at the time whether it was the virus or not. And I described and developed symptoms that were not known to be coronavirus symptoms at the time, but did turn out to be. So I was kind of at the beginning stage, watching it all happen and questioning my body, my symptoms, myself in relation to it. So pretty strange. And also I quickly became kind of an expert in what was going on because I was sick, a little scared, and reading, and then watching everybody else kind of not wanting to lock down, or we'll just have this last party, or we'll just get together and sing one more time. And I'm sending out these emails going, don't do it, don't do it. Like whatever it is that I've got is not worth that. Yeah. So I was actually pretty much in my bed. You know, it came in waves. So I was like thinking I was better. I'd get up for a few days, absolutely knock myself back to bed. So that kind of went on and off for about 6 weeks. So I was pretty sick. And I live alone with a big dog who is used to long, good walks.
Oh, poor Maisie.
Poor Maisie, exactly. So she had 6 weeks of the laziest she had ever been. She was, I mean, I literally, like, again, I didn't want to go out and infect anybody. So I was like literally getting myself out of bed in the middle of the night when it was dark and people wouldn't be around. And so I live in the back of somebody's house, in a little tiny house in the garden. So I would go to the front of the house. I got a glow-in-the-dark frisbee, and I would throw the frisbee up and down the street for Maisie to get at least some exercise and use some of the energy that she was getting from sharing all my food with me while I was in bed. So that it was pretty grim, and it was also really interesting to see different, you know, like you said, I have friends in most corners of the world. So in particular in England, the States, Australia, and Israel, I guess, are kind of my main people. And so watching the difference in that and the difference in my people, right? Some people were just like, we need to do this, we're doing it. Some people were like, I cannot bear this for one more second. I need to be in the ocean, at the beach, climbing a hill, whatever it is that we all thought we needed and couldn't live without. So that was my initial experience. other thing that happened for me was I'd started actually at the beginning of 2020 to do you know The Artist's Way, Julia Cameron? She read.
I was introduced to The Artist's Way in 1996. Actually did that and the follow-up book, and picked it up in a beautiful bookshop called the Bodhi Tree in Los Angeles.
Oh, nice.
She signed copies. She was there selling these books. Brilliant. The Artist's Way is astonishing. Changed my attitude towards self-development 25 years ago.
Wow.
Clearly found Julia's work and are loving it. I found writing the diary quite challenging, actually. I couldn't keep that up for a sustained period of time.
It's an interesting one. So I have the book. I haven't read it. I have a pattern in the last, I guess it's getting on for, maybe it's even 12 to 15 years, pretty much since I did my law degree, that I haven't been able to read much for pleasure, right?
Yeah.
And I, you know me, I was an avid reader. I would, devour books from childhood. And suddenly I'm in this space where I find it really difficult to read. I have piles of books around me. I'm actually back to it in this last few months a little bit more, but it's been years. So this book, The Artist's Way, was recommended by my therapist. It's been on my bedside table for a long time. And I still haven't read it, but I did get as far as the instructions for morning pages, and I love it. So January 2020, I started morning pages, and I mostly kept it up. I wasn't necessarily stringent about every day until I got sick. And then when I got sick, I started writing every day, and I actually started day one. Like I marked day one, which is, I know right now how many days it's been since I first got sick. So I had this kind of monitoring of my own story as I was going through it, which is pretty interesting. Although the rules around morning pages, right? You don't write it to go back to. You don't really go back and read through, right? You just do this stream of consciousness. And it's fantastic. I mean, I really, really love it. For me, it's kind of like a way of clearing out the crap before you start your day, right? So it's like, instead of all the stuff that you unconsciously bring with for the new day, you clear that out, you get a kind of good look at yourself, and then move on. And so that was another interesting aspect of lockdown. Plus, what was I going to say? I was going to say something else about that kind of insularity. Right. So I have a great therapist. I live in California. Of course, I have a great therapist. And I have spent many years, probably 4 years, listening to myself saying, I need more time by myself. I need quiet time. I need a retreat. I need, all of this, like time by myself. And I don't have much time by myself. I work a lot. I do a lot of activities. I have a lot of commitments. But whenever I do have a moment to myself, I find myself very quickly going, I'm going to go for a walk. Who's going to come with me on my walk? Who shall I text? Who's doing what? Let me just check what I might be missing out on, right? Which means that my alone time never happened. Suddenly I'm knocked in my bed. I'm forced to sit and have some time alone. And I absolutely thrived, regardless, in spite of being sick. The rest of it was just absolutely what I needed. Time to slow, time to be, time to do. I didn't do much. I've got thousands of unfinished projects. I made some headway on some of them. One of them I finished 2 weeks ago. But anyway, I have millions of things that I'm always wanting to do, and more of them too. But I did do some stuff I've wanted to write for a long time, and I have kind of little snippets of stuff in notebooks and on the computer. And I started so longer term, not in those first few months, but longer term, what's happened for me, and this is another answer to part of your question, I have reconnected with some of my distant friends in a way that's totally different because of the lockdown, even though we've always been at great distance.
Yeah.
So, for example, I've lived in California for 9 years now. My brother lives in Florida, has done for more years. And we've been apart from our parents and each other for Pesach for many, many, many years. I can't remember the last time we were all together. It's infrequent throughout our adult life. Last year, we did a Zoom Seder. We've never done one before. I've used Zoom for the last 4 years or something, but it never occurred to us, right? So suddenly we just had our second Zoom Seder. I have a really good friend in Australia who I met in Israel many years ago. And we've stayed in contact off and on over the years. She came to visit when Mills was 3, so 20 years ago. But we've never had ongoing contact. Well, she's a meditation teacher. Her classes moved online with the lockdown. We kind of renewed contact. She saw I'd been ill. She checked in on me. I started going to her meditation classes. They're like in the morning on a Friday for Australia. They're my Thursday evening. It's fantastic. So I now have a weekly practice, not just that I have a practice, which is lovely, but I listen to this guided meditation which is the voice of my dear friend from 30 years ago, which I love. And we've renewed our friendship. We talk frequently. She's the person that checks my job applications. I do the same for her. We've been writing and sharing. That's been really, really lovely. I have another friend in Wales where I've started sharing with critiquing each other's poetry, and it's forcing me to I don't have anything published yet. Actually, she posted a couple of my things, but that beginning to kind of rework those things and have them out there. So it's really, I feel like I've had this, it's been fabulous to slow down, to ground myself, to kind of develop me in a way that I've never done before, and discover my inner introvert, which I didn't know she was there, and I like her.
I've always enjoyed the introvert in me as well as both. I believe we're all ambiverts. You just need to know the balance of any given moment. Something you said earlier, I just want to go back to actually, because it made me smile a little bit when you were talking about how you spent 4 years telling your therapist you need more time and more space for yourself. This popped up in a conversation I was having with someone just a couple of weeks ago, because I was discussing it as well, about how I sometimes need space. But when I say that, I don't preclude my dog.
Oh, no.
So it's interesting, isn't it? So I started musing about this. When I say I need space, I'm really saying I need space from humans, which then suggests, what is it about my relationship with my dog that is so authentic? I don't need space from them.
Right.
And clearly we're going to empathize with this.
Yeah, so you could say, rather than I need time by myself, I need time with my dog, right?
Right.
They're kind of interchangeable. I think that and especially for me, having gone through this time of illness with her, right? And this lockdown, she always came to work with me anyway. So it's not like we were separated, but there was more time that I would leave her. And I tell you, in the last year, the maximum I leave her is an hour on a Monday afternoon because sometimes my therapy is in my therapist's garden now rather than all the time online. She's not so keen on online. But that's the only time I leave her, and so now we've become ridiculously bonded. But I would say that there's so much there. There's so much in the relationship with the dog. First of all, they are so pure in spirit and being that there is no doing, right? It's the being together rather than the doing. There's no caretaking. There's no worrying about feelings. There's no, they are just present and there for us and pure in joy and love. And you've seen my sweet puppy. Like there's nothing more pure. And I mean, the times, I'm just thinking of the times more recently when I've traveled, and I will often say, oh, I walk so much because my dog needs it. And when I'm on vacation without the dog, I realize that it's me that needs it just as much or more than her, right? Because that's where I clear my head. And there's something about that, like being outside, the walking meditation to some extent. Although sometimes I'll do it with, headphones and a audio book or music or whatever, but in general there's something really meditative about the walking that happens. And I don't know, I'm just thinking about how she's, the interaction of emotions too, where there is no need for speaking, there's no need for direct communication, and yet she will know the moment my mood changes to something where, in her view, I could do with a lick in the face. And she's usually right.
And yeah, well, I trust all the dogs that I've lived with to have the reading of me far better than I do at times. My one with Rocky, he is like that as you describe Maisie, right?
Yeah.
The only thing is, when it comes to reading moods, he's not that sophisticated at that. So if I get up, he's like, "Yes, we're going out," and it doesn't matter that I was just getting up to, just stretch. He's ready to go. So he doesn't show that much long-term empathy. He's more about himself, but he's a young one. Look, I want to come back to we were talking before about our environments needing to feel reflected in our environment, and you were talking there before about kind of the well-being of practice, whether it's therapeutic practice, whether it's meditative, your journaling. Mental well-being is hugely popular now. It's on leaders' radars, it's on legal radars, right? I mean, everybody's looking at it. What have you observed? And you have operated in different environments where you probably have quite a good sight of what it looks like. What have you observed?
Well, I think another part of having been in, sick and lying in my sick bed watching everything close down, and like I said, hearing from friends who responded, better or worse in the situation. I think that we all, regardless of our home situations, regardless of who we shared that home space with, whether it was other people or not, we were all forced to face ourselves in a way that we're not in normal everyday life. And I think that came up very clearly, right? That when you're alone with yourself, that means all the aspects of yourself, the aspects that you don't necessarily like to dwell on, that you often, refuse to see or refuse to deal with. So the shadow self, right? We were all faced with those shadows. And so that, I think that's been a really, really interesting for everybody to observe how they manage, to observe how our loved ones manage, and then to see what's out there to help when we need it, because we do need it, right? And I know for me, just to out myself about it, one of the things that came up for me that I don't think I've ever really dwelled in before was this, and it was related to the illness, but it was an incredible level of self-pity, which is really not in my story of me, right? I'm like jolly, always finding the next thing to be in, pretty, I think I'm pretty good at being or giving in my narratives for others too, right? I tend to try and see the good in most places, even though I have an edge of cynicism around it. But to find myself in this I mean, I was really in some deep self-pity, like I was sick, people weren't really noticing, like where were all the people bringing me meals and caring about me and asking about me? And, some people did, and it was lovely to be able to, um, lean into that. And there were a lot of people that really didn't show up for me. And beginning, like noticing that, allowing myself to feel how that felt, even though there are, then the next stage of it, I think that unpicking for me was really noticing that actually the way I show up in the world is not one that allows other people to really step in and take care of me, right? If you present yourself as capable, independent, no issues, etc., people don't have you in the book as somebody to check in on. And it's really difficult to change. It's like changing an existing contract with someone, right? You've set up a friendship or a relationship with certain parameters, and then you go and, want something different. Well, the unsuspecting person on the other side of the equation doesn't know that. So I think that's been a big realization for me. It's made me change, but it's made me change everything. It made me see my work situation in a different way. It made me, and understanding some depth in that too, right? Like that it's not just that my work situation wasn't what I wanted it to be. It was also reminiscent of patterns from family dynamics that don't work that well for me, but of course are comfortable and familiar. And so that real kind of, so I guess I'm saying two things, right? I'm saying the ability to kind of really be in the depths of feelings, whether they're nice ones or not, together with the ability to kind of step outside and view what's going on in those things. And all of that is possible when there's time. That was the thing for me, is that actually I'm a person that's always been very quick. I get a lot done. I'm very efficient. I have a fast brain. And, and to suddenly be in a position where I'm valuing the opposite of that. I'm noticing that, yeah, I can do some quick thinking, but the thinking I come up with that's a lot slower, more deliberate, more embodied is really different. And I think more valuable, more deep, more intimate, a more intimate sharing of myself with the world. And I guess that's where I've come to, is like, if I want to widen it to a larger existential question, why am I here? Why are we here? I think the important factor in that becomes the I. Like there is something whatever it is I'm supposed to do, and I don't mean that by some giant, big, meaningful purpose, but my doing me is me based, and the only person that can do that is me. And I know now that there is a me that comes out of a stew, if you like. I wrote a little poem called Ruby Stew Days, because I was stewing in my own juices over and over and over. And there is a version of me that comes out differently there, and I want to get to know that more. Like it really piqued my interest. And I've kind of had this, like, actually I'm calming and slowing and growing into me in a way that I have never had an opportunity to do before.
It's just a more gentle way of being that sounds calmer. I was reading, well, I wasn't reading, I listen. I can't read books since I finished my degree, so Audible is just a send of angels to me. So on my dog walks, not everyone, sometimes I like just tranquility and peace and quiet, but sometimes I'll listen to books. And I just finished one. I think if you haven't read her, you'd love it. The Anatomy of Loneliness by Teal Swan.
Oh, I've seen it, but I haven't read it. I will also listen. I'll put it on my library list. Yeah.
Put it on your library list. And she talks actually about your evil twin. You were talking about shadows before, but that evil twin that makes decisions in the moment to separate or push or pull. And she talks about this concept that actually we're all fundamentally lonely. That's why we seek connection. And the funny thing is that we don't always know how to seek connection in the right way. So we continue to be lonely even when we're connected.
Right.
So unless we take a look at that moment, as I was listening to her, I was reflecting and thinking, but it's so hard to be still in a world, when you live in a world that values speed and action.
Yeah.
And so when I'm on a dog walk every day since lockdown started, I have made a thing where I just stop. I actually set my mobile alarm on my phone for 3 minutes, and I just stand wherever I am with my eyes closed, and the dogs are mincing around the place around me, and I just start listening.
Right.
It starts with lots of noise that then starts to distinguish it's 4 or 5 different birds, and then the wind, and then traffic noise, and then human noise, and just, it's so lovely just to be still. 3 minutes a day. It's not a lot to commit to, but it does make a difference.
It really makes a difference. But I think so that embedding into the space, so there's space and time, right? And so obviously there's more dimensions, but space and time for the moment. So the time piece is one, but the other, and I'm guessing you have this too with the dog walks, when you have a regular place that you walk. And and I have multiple of them, but I do, well, there's one of them in particular which I went to kind of at, odd hours when I was recovering too, so that we could get a bit of a walk, even though it was tough for me to walk at all. But it's a place where I had one job where I drove by, that was my route to work for 2 years. And so I stopped off there and walked there every morning for 2 years, pretty much. And so I know it. I know the parts, I know the trees, I know the plants, I know the seasons, I know the leaves, I know the colors they change. And then you get to see the changes every day, regardless of the constancies, right? Which is also really beautiful. And this is, there'll be a storm and a tree will come down. So this is redwood forest, right? So a tree down is a huge change of environment, but also a fast swallowing into a new ecosystem. I mean, it's just beautiful to watch. But that piece, the same when I used to, when I was in Oxford and I used to ride my bike to work, and I had my same, every pothole, every crack in the pavement, and yet there's this kind of familiarity and novelty within it every day. And so that, I think that playing with that space and time aspect are also part of the grounding, right? And it's interesting. I will read the book, and I don't know that I agree right now that we all start from lonely. I feel like there's an acceptance of self that takes us away from the loneliness, and that the loneliness actually maybe comes from the non-acceptance of the parts of ourselves which we're not so keen on. And so that's where I'm really interested now. It kind of started from a place of wanting to assist in what I call difficult conversations, right? And there's so many of them in so many different aspects. And then learning that the way to do those means also the same within oneself. So all of those aspects which we sometimes indulge by not being accountable for, right? So with the kind of, I didn't behave that well in that situation. Oh, I'm just going to sweep that under the carpet and hope that I do better next time. And we know in, any kind of relationship with others and then with ourselves, sweeping under the carpet doesn't make it better the next time, right? It keeps it exactly as it is, or even more embedded. And so there's something about that, about really waking up to all the parts of oneself. There's some work that I do, that I'm in some groups with NVC, nonviolent communication, and also this kind of resonance work around the neuroscience of how we function. And in those groups, there's a really beautiful practice of, at the beginning, they'll say, we welcome all of you. And then they say, we welcome all of the parts of you, all of those parts, even the ones that you don't normally show up with or admit that you're showing up with. And that, I think there's something really important in that within ourselves, as well as with each other. So that really, like, that's been a big part of my kind of changing over this last year, and part of what I don't really know what I'm going to do next, but it's going to be something around that. It's around the difficult conversations and the internal work that needs to be done in order to do that outside of ourselves. And I feel like that ties into all of the really big work of our time, right? We live in some crazy times. We live in some desperate, urgent times. And there's really important work that needs to be done. And so many good people that want to do it, who find themselves immobilized with what do we do? How do we start, etc. And I think that's a thing that's become really clear for me in this last little while, is that it's all inner work. Like, the inner work is the outer work. There is no other place to start, etc.
I've spent 20 years working with leadership programs, right? Coaching. You don't start with the self, it's all theoretical. So it's easy to talk about others.
Right.
I know all the rules of how I'm meant to be, but actually I don't want to use any of them because I'm not comfortable with that. So I've got to deal with why I'm not comfortable with it before those rules make sense.
Right. Right.
And that's true in every aspect. And it's also a bit like, I might get a personal trainer, but that's not going to give me a six pack. I'm actually going to have to do the exercise every day if I want a six pack.
Right.
Getting the personal trainer is not going to do it for me. So I think from just that perspective, that especially around nonviolent communication, and with the neuroscience, the brain is wired in a certain way to respond and react anyway, right? So it's about understanding what is it that we see as either threatening situations that flood us, and how we can also stop the flooding. And a lot of the time, what I observe is that some people catastrophize. So it's very easy. They lean into a feeling and they dive into it, and they get completely immersed in it and swamped, and they identify with the feeling. They become the feeling, and then everything's just crap.
Yeah.
The skill, I think, for me has always been not to not do that, because that, I think, that's human nature, right? That's part of our worry and concern. But to be able to learn to recognize a feeling and then to accept it, and then to investigate in that kind of gentle way, because that's how you then don't identify, which means learning to sit with feelings. And that's where I think the challenge is in your topic, actually in the work that I do with corporates and executives, is it starts with a hefty look at yourself, and what's there. Sometimes you just got to say it out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we always do. I think that we are so skilled in the covering up of it that it isn't. I mean, yes, there is a part of you that knows what's there, but I think that we are so skilled in not going there. And like we were saying earlier, in telling ourselves stories of who we are, right? We have these narratives that are built on either what we've been told by others or the opposite of what we've been told by others. Because we're rebelling, they still form our stories of ourselves. And that, like, I mean, you're absolutely spot on in terms of the feelings, and how you can learn to allow yourself to feel those feelings, be in them as deeply as possible, and then still finding the way through the other side, kind of the wormhole, right? Like, that is where you get to these like brave new worlds that open up to you when you are able to kind of get in there. And there's, I mean, the terminology that my good friend Kristen, who teaches MVC, she uses this warm curiosity, right? Like, how do you kind of go, oh, okay, I'm feeling something that doesn't feel nice. What is it? Let's look at what that is, where it might have come from, how it might have arisen. And those already will often be things that we don't want to be admitting to ourselves, right? So like, a good example for me, I've been recently involved in I took a class. I took a class in autumn last year on systems thinking, run by Fritjof Capra, who's a genius and just absolutely brilliant guy. Online course, videotaped, but then a kind of community of people globally who are taking the course. So self-selected thinkers who, and so it's really great. It's a really great connection with people. And, so we have these like ongoing study groups, and I'm facilitating one for the next course now. And there's an interesting thing around noticing so for me, certain people that I struggle with in those groups, right? And so instead of doing my normal, like, no, I don't, you're a whatever, a know-it-all, or you're a privileged white man and you think, blah, all of those things. So instead of kind of going, well, I don't like this person because they whatever, what I've actually done is reach out and have one-on-one discussions with these people, because and it's clear to me every time I do it. Like, so when something arises for me, instead of going, oh, I don't like them, the first thing I do is kind of go, okay, let's chat. And on a one-to-one, we're human, right? We're all human. We've all got our flaws. We've all got our reasons that we end up being where we are. And there's something around that, like admitting. I just did one recently, and I kind of started the conversation by saying, I have to say I'm coming to this with multiple chips on my shoulders, right? I have chips around white men and privilege. I have chips around the patriarchy. I have chips around whatever, millions and millions and millions of things.
Put all your chips on the table, and it was like a big pile of chips.
Right, totally. And if I'm saying that, there's something really powerful about giving away that power, right? So I'm opening and I'm saying, these are my sensitive points. And yet I still want to make my point to you. I still want to say to you that this is how these things make me feel, even though I've got my slightly jaded glasses on that I know is making me see it that way, but it is still that way to some extent, and I want to discuss it. It's a little bit like, great example, it's a little bit like being premenstrual, and people are like, oh, you're grumpy because you're premenstrual. Yes, things may be exacerbated, and they are all topics that are relevant generally, right? So it's a lens, it's a way of seeing things that are issues and need to be.
Although that example sounds like a microaggression that I might not be necessarily that comfortable saying to anybody these days.
I think I think that's a really interesting, as a woman who's now menopausal, and in it's another big factor over this last year. Like, so I just going back to being sick. So I was ill for about 6 weeks, and then I ended up with these kind of ongoing symptoms. There's fatigue, there's muscle aches. I mean, those are kind of the main things. And it's relatively debilitating. I ran a 10K 2 days before I got sick. I've tried a couple of times to run a couple of miles. I can't do it at the moment. Anyway, but so there's brain fog, there's muscle aches, there's fatigue. They're all menopause symptoms too. I can't know if I'm a long COVID person or if it's menopause or if it's both, whatever. And does it matter? No, the reality is I am living in a body that is currently going through changes. And instead of going, well, it's this reason and I'll pop a pill for that, like, it's like, actually, let me be in it and feel it. And so one of the things that's coming up for me right now, which I think is menopause related, is anxiety. I've never had anxiety before.
Oh,
I don't think I've ever said I am anxious, and it's a massive learning experience in so many ways. Like that, the feeling of my body feels like it's functioning on a different frequency. It's moving in a way that it didn't do before. And of course, I can also understand others and their anxiety in a way that I've never been able to do before, right? Like, I've got this insight into something completely different, and I've got this body that comes with me through it. And that's what I was going to say about the embodiment. Like, I think it's a really interesting one of the really interesting aspects of, say, hot flashes is like, it's like a reminder multiple times a day that for this lifetime I am enclosed in this shell, and that it has its own life, that it does different things in. And that like reminder, to me, that's, I don't know, I think that's it's a good thing to remember. It's kind of a satisfying thing around limitations too, which is that like part of accepting reality, that there are limitations to my being.
Ruby, I know just by looking at my Runkeeper app at my average pace year on year, there is a reality that dawns on me that I love running, but I just can't run as far or as fast as I used to. I might well be fit for my age, but I can't. And I'll get on the machine and I'll get off after, 45 minutes or an hour, and it'll be like, I've worked really hard. And I look at, oh, really? But actually, I'm 50 and the expectations, it's just hard. I think what happens is it's mortality, right? It's acceptance. And part of what you're describing in physical changes, hormonal changes, bodily changes, that's a physical manifestation of some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, which is more emotive and spiritual.
Right.
Which is about unlocking that, and what you described, a kind of greater empathy because of your experiences for others. You weren't short on empathy, but
thanks.
Well, we didn't say, but you and I have known each other over 30 plus years, so I know you to have empathy. But to enhance that, empathy is a choice, right? If you can genuinely understand what someone else is going through. I mean,
I think,
go on, come back.
I was just going to say that the physical, the emotive, and the spiritual are all, of course, interconnected. And I feel like that's something else that's really special around the time of life that we're at, in terms of, we are, to some extent, the first generation that gets this whole other bite at life, right? Like, we are in our 50s at a time where that is not the ending of anything, right? It's kind of the beginning of something different. And that we, for whatever means, I think a lot of the people that are our age have either come to a point where they've achieved what they thought they wanted to achieve and it isn't satisfying, and so they go off and search for something else. Or there's people like you and me, actually, that have pretty much had a very early realization that happiness does not necessarily correlate to what society tells us that we need, and we've kind of made our own path through. And regardless of that, even though we're people that have done things a little bit differently, we still get to this point of change at this age where there's more of a integration of all of those parts of ourselves, which is both insular and external, to do with our place in community, society. And that like integration, the whole kind of view of it, I think is, we are really lucky to be living at the time that we are, and able to, do something with that, to actually bring that in. And I don't know, I have kind of a strong feeling of this kind of, becoming a crone, becoming an elder, becoming like a point where, I know some stuff now, like I can actually be useful.
Well, when you say that, you trigger for me actually something that came up in my therapy 4 or 5 years ago, when I realized I'd actually grown into the person I was aspiring to be in my 20s. Right. But in my 20s, I was just an idiot because I wasn't that person. But I really wanted to be this person. So I played this, oh, what an idiot. But then suddenly, I had actually grown into that person. I quite liked him. I had respect for what he did.
Right.
And I wasn't sure quite how to play it out. I couldn't find this authentic balance of, I wasn't this 25-year-old trying to be a 45-year-old in business. I actually was a 45-year-old in business, and it was working. And I think there was really something in that recognition. But I also would say that, you know, I did get to spend 5 years pretty much sitting under a tree meditating, which does bring a sense of balance and chi to one's to one's life. And I'm not sure I could do it now, but I could do it when I was 30. And it was the best 5 years where I, you know, earned nothing. I just invested in energy and myself and my Labrador at the time.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, it's interesting because of course I come from a very different place, which is that I never got to stop for 5 years. And I also didn't have a clear view and still don't have a clear view, right? Like I've never been a person that says, I want to be this, I want to do this. I don't have a vision. And a little bit like we were saying earlier, what I do have is the not, right? I know that I don't want to be a whole string of things. I know that I don't want to do things a whole way that I've either seen in my family or see in the mainstream media or whatever it is. Like I've always done something different to that, but not necessarily with a direction. And though, I mean, that's something which is an ongoing issue for me. To some extent, to some extent, it's the mark of my life that I have this flow and openness and adventure and, you know, surprise along the way. And it's also a giant insecurity that there's a huge failing within me, that I don't have a direction or an idea. And
that's a story, though, that you're telling yourself that you need to have that and therefore beat yourself up for not having one. Who told you you need to have one, and who says they're true and right?
Right, totally. And though that, you know, most people seem to have a direction, and I've done things along the way which have worked out really well, right? So like, you'll know, I decided to do law. I put myself through law school at the same time as single parenting, a little girl. And I got I was good at it. I got very quickly to a really good position, and I left it, right? And I left it. I mean, when I moved to the States at the beginning, I intended to move here and take the bar and continue being an immigration lawyer. And instead, what I did was listen to my resonance around things I was trying to do, and noticed that I was having literally a physical response to not being able to do that. And I'm trying to take this path where I listen to the resonance of myself and my body in relation to things, and then I get left with these giant questions, right? Like, and it's like 9 years later, and I still have moments where I'm just like, am I a complete idiot for not doing, and I could go back, my law firm would have me back, I could go back, right, and do that. And and to kind of be
so
like,
miserable.
I mean, but I wasn't miserable when I was doing it. I loved my job. I never questioned it. Like, I really loved it. And I intended to do it when I moved here. And instead I've kind of like, I have this, whatever, I've started on this path that I don't know what it is. There's something about resonance though.
Yeah, but maybe it's even more, because I'm listening to you and I listen to your stories and I know history as well because I have context for you. But you're moving forward.
Yeah.
You're not looking back. I've never known you in any aspect to revisit something a second time if it's done.
Right. Well, and so I suppose what's interesting for me there is I didn't know it was done until I found myself not doing it.
Right. Okay. So yeah.
Obviously, I've kind of made decisions to leave or to change, which like I'm doing now. I mean, right now I've given notice in my job. I end at the end of May. I don't know what's next. I have, pretty much no idea.
Well, Don Miguel Ruiz, who's one of my favorite authors to read, in his book, The Three Questions, which is the latest one, which I would also recommend, says you cannot answer any big question without being able to answer the not question. So when somebody says, what is love? You can only answer that when you know what love is not.
Oh, see, that's really interesting, because I'm kind of shifting the other way around, right? Where I'm trying to not frame in the not, because I had so much of knowing what I don't want, and energy follows thought, right? And so when you're thinking of the not, you're putting the energy into the not and not into the is.
Yeah, and he's not saying you put the energy in. He's saying you can't get started until you know the not. You've actually got to start with that, because that's the obstacle you're going to bring up later. So start with it, and then
headway. Yeah, I'm making some headway. I'm on to the next stage, which is trying to find the is. Yeah. And it's these places where, like, a little bit like I was saying about the difficult conversations, they're the places where we don't necessarily have the words, right? The concepts are a little bit loose. The terminology, the vocabulary that we have is often limited to the not, because those are the places where you can identify and describe. And I'm trying to, I think this is a little bit what I've always done, is kind of whatever, balance, surf on the wave of magic. Like, there is that place where something different happens, and being able to step into that is about stepping into the unknown in a lot of ways, right? Like, that's how I got myself to make the decisions right now, is that while I am locked into something that isn't working for me, I'm not gonna find the next thing that may work for me, because I'm in the other. So there's something about taking your head out to the great unknown again.
Well, and I think there was a word you used earlier. You said you used the word bravery. And the more I listen to you, the more what really comes to mind is actually, it requires a sense of courage. It requires us to be vulnerable to ourselves, to others. The conversations you're talking about actually requires people to have a level of emotional intelligence that won't take it personally when you do say, by the way, here's a bowl of chips I have about people like you. Yeah. But let's have a conversation, because I want to make sure it doesn't. I'm cognizant of my bias, so I'm putting it out there. Please don't take it. But actually, you've got to be at a certain level to be like, whoa, okay, thanks for sharing. Let's make this brief, if possible.
Well, I think also one of the things you said in there, right, about let's not take this personally. And I think that's a really nuanced place, right? Because so how do we, in the same way that nothing is personal, everything is personal. So in some senses, it's, so how do we, there's a book that I love, actually, which I quoted a little bit from her second book when I was talking about age and our generation, but actually the first book is a woman called Jet Saris, and the first book is called Undefended Love, and it is the best book on relationships ever. And one of the reasons that, I struggle with finding a meaningful relationship, because I want something meaningful and undefended in as much as it can be. And so that point where it's like, okay, conversation, especially if I'm sharing my vulnerability and I'm asking you to do the same, it is personal. It's all personal. It couldn't be more personal. And yet, how do we do it in a way that we don't need to be defended? And that's part of that ability to say, these are my chips, right? If I say to you, this is the bias that I come from, I have good reason for coming from it, and I'm happy to admit that I come from it. But I want to have a conversation with you where I'm clear about that. And so when I revert to something that is ensconced in my thinking, that is limited by those prejudices, I'm giving you license to point it out to me, but I'm also asking you to do it kindly, right? You don't need to scream and shout at me and tell me that that's where it is. I've given it to you kindly and openly, and I'm asking to be able to do the same to you, but I can't control you and how you feel. So actually, how can I set up a conversation in which I am willing to be open and undefended, and I don't require of you to do anything? Because it's not about me.
Well, that's the whole point, right? That's actually how I would do it. So when you're saying something, and I'm acknowledging that actually it's not personal and it's completely personal, what I realize in my head as I'm actually listening to you, when I then process the initial feeling of, hello, actually, that says more about you than it does me. My job here is not to own your feeling. My job here is to just understand it. We might actually find ourselves, because I believe this, Hannah, that the one real positive out of the last year for me is a sense of global human empathy.
Right.
Because although, and someone said it beautifully at the beginning of these lockdown sessions to me, I said, oh, you know, we're all in the same storm. He said, I said, we're all in the same boat. He goes, no, Brad, we're not. He goes, we're all in the same storm. We're all in different boats. And it was in that moment that I started to look at this kind of this opportunity for global human empathy. We've all experienced it. And that's fantastic.
And I mean, what perfect timing when really the most urgent issue of our time is the climate crisis. And we are entering into a period of time that is, well, we're running out of it rapidly, but, you know, we have a couple of years to make some really significant changes. And that's another one in which we are not in the same boat, right? There are huge swaths of the global population that do not need persuading of anything because they've been experiencing it for a decade. And then there are those of us who are still kind of going, oh, is there anything going on? You know, I wrote a little piece last year with the wildfires in California, you know, where it was like, there were headlines on like, we don't know the long-term effect of the bad air quality. What are you talking about? We don't know it. People in India have been living awful air quality for years and years and years. We know exactly what the long-term effects are. What you mean is we haven't cared about it, or we don't know the effects on white people instead of brown people. Like, it's, you know, there's complete nonsense to be like, we don't know this yet. Suddenly it's occurring to us. Like, when is going to be the point where we really look at what's been happening and tie together all of the events and really look at what we can do? That's, you know, that's the big issue of our times ahead of us, and the big question as to whether we're going to be able to do anything about it. And I love the idea of the development of global empathy. And I think in exactly the same way as we talked about the inside and outside of oneself, it's exactly that, right? It's a global, and it's about what happened in our small communities along the way. And it's another thing that's been fantastic from the epidemic, is having, you know, the small community groups that have shared and volunteered and looked out for each other, and the sharing of resources that's been taking place and is continuing. And those are the things that are going to make the difference for the future of humanity.
And I hope that people will stop using global and pandemic together, because it seems to me that you don't need the word global if you're going to use the word pandemic.
Right. Yeah.
As someone who has studied language, you can confirm this to me, because I get really annoyed when I hear people saying, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. No, mate, we're just in the middle of a pandemic. Don't make it a whole global thing. It already is.
It's global, well, and everything's global. And I think that, like, but I think that really has, you know, again, to come back to the interconnectedness of everything and of everything that there is, that has been something which is becoming clearer, like that. And it, you know, it's a fuzzy state, right? It's this kind of ability to understand systems of the ecosystems and all the systems of the world and how we fit into them, and how we act, what we do, and where that takes us. Like those are all, it's all this interplay of the insular and the exterior that we've been talking about throughout. And I think that we are in a really amazing place to be doing that. We've got this combination of technology and connectedness, as well as our local communities and the physicality of proximity. And I think that leaves us in a really, we're in a place where it could happen. Was it Jimi Hendrix who talked about the power of love rather than the love of power?
Yeah.
But that balance, that's where we are.
And then John Lennon came in with "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." So you have to be mindful and conscious for a moment. Ruthanna Barnett, Ruby, Fanna, thank you so much for being one of our final episodes on the lockdown sessions. It's been just beautiful talking to you.
It's always fabulous to talk with you, Brad. It's nice to hang out. Great.
Lovely.